Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We got a really fascinating request for today's topic.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Someone wrote in and asked us to take a look at Mexican-American immigration
Okay.
in the early 21st century.
Okay.
And they pointed us to this history podcast
Uh-huh.
called, let me see here,
Hmm.
Mexican Americans and Immigration Reform in the 21st Century from a show called Mr. Hutchings History.
Oh, that's a good one. It's a great episode to really dig into because it gets into all those complexities of immigration, especially by the early 2000s.
Right.
When, Mexican Americans had already become the largest Hispanic group in the U.S.
Right.
They were already making a huge impact on the political and cultural landscape, particularly in states like California and Texas, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, well, let's set the stage here. The podcast starts by throwing out some pretty big numbers,
Yeah.
talking about just how many Mexican Americans were living in the U.S. at the time.
Right.
I think it said something about 1 in 14 Americans being of Mexican descent by the early 2000s.
Yeah, they said that 64% of all Latinos in the U.S. were of Mexican origin.
Wow.
So yeah, you're right, like 1 out of every 14 people you meet,
Right.
which really highlights how significant this population was and still is in shaping American society.
That's a lot more than I would have guessed.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a major demographic force here, and the podcast specifically calls out California and Texas.
Exactly.
What was going on in those states.
So those two states alone were home to half of all Mexican Americans.
Wow.
In California, Latinos made up a third of the state's population by 2007.
Wow, that's huge,
And
Phil.
get this, almost half of all the kids in California schools were Latino.
Wow, half the kids. That's got to be a huge cultural shift.
Huge.
Did the podcast talk about what kind of impact that was having on, on society?
Oh, yeah, they did. And projections from that time indicated Latinos would actually become the majority in California by 2040.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal considering California's history and how the state has evolved since becoming part of the U.S. back in 1848. It's really interesting.
That's fascinating. We always hear about California's large Latino population, but I never really thought about the historical context like that.
Yeah.
And what about Texas?
Right.
Was it seeing similar trends?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Texas was on a similar path, with Latinos making up 30% of the population in 2007.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is how that translated into political power.
Oh, how so?
Well, they held a significant number of seats in both the state legislature and even the U.S. Congress.
So not just a cultural presence, but a real political force, too.
Absolutely.
It makes you realize how much influence the Mexican-American community was gaining at the time.
For sure.
But the podcast didn't just focus on Mexico, did it?
You're right, it didn't.
Mm.
They also talked about this wave of immigration from Central America that started in the late 20th century.
Right.
Driven by a lot of unrest and hardship in countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua.
Right. I remember reading about the civil wars and poverty that forced so many people to flee those countries and seek refuge in the U.S.
Yeah.
So how did the U.S. government handle this wave of Central American immigrants?
Well, back in 1980, the U.S. passed the Refugee Act,
Okay.
which was designed to help people fleeing political persecution. But how it was actually applied, especially during the Reagan era, got really complicated.
Okay.
The podcast does a good job of breaking that down.
Yeah, wasn't there some controversy around how the Reagan administration treated different groups of refugees?
You're right, there was.
Yeah.
The administration often rejected asylum claims from people coming from El Salvador and Guatemala,
Mm-hmm.
viewing them as economic migrants and not political refugees.
Right.
But at the same time, they were much more welcoming to Nicaraguans fleeing communist rule.
Oh, interesting.
So you can really see how the Cold War was influencing U.S. immigration policy during that time.
That's really thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It seems like the criteria for who gets granted asylum wasn't always applied consistently
Right.
and was sometimes tangled up in, the political climate of the time,
That's-
which must have been incredibly frustrating for those who were truly seeking refuge from dangerous situations.
For sure. It highlights just how complex the U.S. immigration system was and still is.
Right.
And this is where things get even more interesting,
Okay.
because the podcast goes on to discuss the Simpson-Rodino Act of 1986,
Okay.
which was a major attempt to tackle undocumented immigration head-on.
Okay, that brings up a really important piece of legislation,
Yes.
one that I'm not super familiar with.
Okay.
Can you give me a quick rundown?
Yeah, so basically it was a two-pronged approach.
Okay.
First, it penalized employers for hiring undocumented workers.
Okay.
And then second, and this was huge. It offered amnesty to undocumented immigrants who could prove they had been living in the U.S. continuously since 1982.
Wow.
This meant that roughly 2 million people suddenly had a path to legal residency.
That's huge. That must have been life-changing for so many families.
It was.
But, I mean, didn't the Simpson-Rodino Act also face some criticism?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it just seems like such a massive undertaking. I can't imagine it was universally praised.
Yeah, you're right. It definitely had its critics. Some people argued that it didn't address the root causes of undocumented immigration.
Like what?
Well, specifically, the huge economic disparities between the U.S. and Latin America.
Okay, yeah.
And they felt that no matter how many laws you pass, people will always seek better opportunities for themselves and their families.
Right, that makes sense. It's hard to stop the flow of people when there's such a stark difference in living standards.
Absolutely.
And it's not like the U.S. didn't benefit from the labor of undocumented immigrants, right?
Exactly. The podcast even mentions how some American foreigners who relied heavily on undocumented labor actually supported the Simpson-Rodino Act,
Really?
especially the amnesty provisions. They recognized the vital role these workers played in the U.S. economy, especially in agriculture.
That's an interesting point. Even back then, there was a recognition of the economic contributions of undocumented immigrants, even as the government was trying to regulate their presence.
It really speaks to the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
And speaking of complexity, the podcast also dives into how different historians have viewed this period of immigration, offering a variety of perspectives.
I always find it fascinating to look at history through different lenses.
Me too.
It helps you understand the nuances and see the bigger picture, you know?
For sure.
What were some of the key historical perspectives highlighted in the episode?
Okay, so one prominent historian, Mai and Guy, really critiques the contradictions within U.S. immigration policy.
Okay.
On one hand, the U.S. economy needed undocumented workers, but on the other hand, the government was actively trying to restrict their presence.
Yeah.
It's a double standard that kind of persists to this day.
It's like the U.S. wanted to have its cake and eat it too, benefit from the labor, without acknowledging the people providing it.
Right.
Were there any other historical perspectives that stood out to you?
Well, some scholars, like David Card, focus on what's called economic determinism. Essentially, they argue that global economic inequality, especially between the U.S. and Mexico, is the driving force behind migration patterns,
Okay.
no matter what kind of laws are put in place.
So basically, no border wall or immigration policy can truly stop people from seeking a better life for themselves and their families if the economic incentives are strong enough.
Exactly.
It's a pretty compelling argument.
It is. And then you have social historians like Vicky Ruiz, who focus on the human side of the story.
Okay.
She tells the stories of immigrant families, highlighting their struggles, their resilience, and their determination to preserve their culture while navigating a new and often hostile environment.
That's so important to remember, right?
It is.
Behind all these policy debates and statistics are real people with real lives, dreams, and aspirations.
Absolutely.
It's easy to lose sight of the human element when you're talking about immigration in such abstract terms.
Yeah, for sure. And the podcast brings this human element to life by sharing some incredibly powerful personal stories from primary sources. One that really stuck with me was about a young woman in 1986 who was inspired by her father's experience as a bracero.
Wait, can we pause for a second? I've heard that term bracero before, but can you remind me what it refers to? I think our listener might be wondering the same thing.
Oh, of course. The Bracero program was a guest worker program that ran from the 1940s to the 1960s. It allowed Mexican laborers to come to the U.S. to work, primarily in agriculture, filling labor shortages. It's a really important part of Mexican-American history, and it ties into this woman's story because...
Okay, thanks for the explanation. Now I understand why that historical context is so important for her story, so please, tell me more. What happened to her father?
Well, her father was a bracero, and his experiences working in the U.S. had a profound impact on his family. It instilled in them a sense of connection to the U.S. and a desire for a better life. This woman's story really highlights how family history and cross-border connections can fuel migration for generations.
That's so powerful.
Well,
It's not just an individual choice to immigrate.
right.
It's about continuing a family legacy and pursuing opportunities that were made possible by those who came before you.
Absolutely.
Were there any other personal stories that stood out to you from the podcast?
Absolutely. The story of Rosa Maria Urbina really resonated with me. She crossed the Rio Grande multiple times in the 1980s, risking everything for a chance at economic survival in the U.S. Her story really captures the desperation and determination of so many undocumented workers who are willing to face incredible dangers and hardships just to provide for themselves and their families.
It's a stark reminder that behind these policy debates are real people making incredibly difficult choices driven by circumstances that many of us can only imagine. These personal stories really add a whole new dimension to the conversation about immigration.
They do. And the podcast doesn't stop there. It also points to the legislative records of the Simpson-Rodino Act as another primary source that offers valuable insights. Reading those records allows you to kind of peek behind the curtain and see the political compromises and debates that shaped this landmark piece of legislation. You can see how different stakeholders, from Latino activists to American farmers, fought for their interests and ultimately shaped the outcome.
It sounds like those records offer a fascinating glimpse into the sausage-making process of how immigration policy is made. It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract debates. They involve real people, real power dynamics, and real consequences. It's all starting to make a lot more sense now.
It is fascinating to see how all these different pieces fit together, and the podcast does a great job of weaving them together to create a comprehensive narrative. To wrap up this part of our deep dive, it touches on the broader impact of immigration reform, focusing on two key areas.
Okay, I'm all ears. What were those two areas of impact?
Firstly, the economic contributions of undocumented immigrants. Despite their lack of legal status, they played a crucial role in the U.S. economy, especially in agriculture, those California and Texas harvests we were talking about, and service industries like hospitality, construction, and domestic work.
It's undeniable that their labor was and continues to be a significant driver of the American economy. So that's the economic side of things. What was the second area of impact?
Social and political transformation. As the Mexican-American population grew, so did their political influence, especially in those key states we've been discussing, California and Texas.
Right. We already talked about their growing representation in state legislatures and Congress. So how did this impact the national conversation about immigration reform?
It put immigration reform squarely on the national agenda. And it's not just about politics. Cities with large Mexican-American populations, like Los Angeles, became vibrant cultural centers, shaping American identity in new and exciting ways.
So we see the ripple effects of immigration extending far beyond just economics, touching on politics, culture, and even the very definition of what it means to be American. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it that way.
It really is. And we've only just begun to explore the depths of this topic. There's so much more to uncover as we delve deeper into the history and legacy of Mexican-American immigration.
It's interesting, as we're talking about all this, I'm struck by how relevant these issues still are today.
Yeah.
Immigration is constantly in the news, and it feels like we're still grappling with many of the same challenges that were present back in the early 2000s.
It's true. It's like we're still having these heated debates about border security and pathways to citizenship and,
Right.
Just how to create an immigration system that's both fair and workable.
Yeah.
It feels like some things never change.
It's like the podcast really drives that point home. We hear about the economic benefits the U.S. reaped from immigrant labor. But then we also see how difficult it was and still is for immigrants to gain legal status.
It's true.
It's like this huge contradiction at the heart of the system.
It's a complex situation, and it has deep historical roots.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most valuable things about exploring this period of history.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us this context
Right.
for understanding why these issues are so challenging to address, even today.
I totally agree. It's like by looking back, we can see how these debates evolved over time
Yeah,
and why finding solutions is so tricky.
absolutely.
These concerns didn't just pop up overnight.
Right, exactly. They're rooted in long-standing historical patterns
Yeah.
and economic realities, and understanding that is crucial for moving forward.
For sure.
But I think it's also important to remember the flip side of this,
What's that?
the enormous contributions that immigrants have made to American society,
Right.
often despite facing incredible obstacles.
Absolutely. The podcast doesn't shy away from highlighting how vital undocumented immigrants were to the U.S. economy, especially in sectors like agriculture
Right,
and those service industries we were talking about earlier.
absolutely. Their labor was and still is a significant part of what keeps the American economy running.
Yeah.
And their impact goes way beyond just economics, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure. When we talk about American culture, like the food, the music, the art,
Yes.
it's impossible to ignore the influence of immigrant communities, particularly those from Mexico and Central America.
It's everywhere. It's a reminder that diversity isn't just something to tolerate, you know?
Right.
It's a source of strength and vibrancy for our country.
Totally.
And it brings us back to that idea of a changing landscape.
Uh-huh.
The U.S. is becoming increasingly diverse.
Yeah.
And the Mexican-American population is at the forefront of that demographic shift.
It's a trend that shows no signs of slowing down.
Nope.
And it just underscores why we need to have these open and honest conversations about immigration in the 21st century.
Right.
I couldn't agree more. We need to move past these simplistic narratives and engage with the real complexities of the issue, taking into account history,
Right.
economics,
Yeah.
human rights.
And I think this historical perspective, like what we're getting from this podcast,
Yes,
is essential for doing that effectively.
absolutely.
It helps us see the nuances, the contradictions,
Right, Luca.
the human stories
Yeah.
that often get lost in the political rhetoric.
It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution,
Right.
and that any approach we take needs to be thoughtful,
Yeah.
humane, and deeply informed by an understanding of the past.
Well said. I think that's a really key takeaway from this whole deep dive.
I agree.
Immigration is complex.
It is.
It's layered.
Yes,
And it's deeply personal for so many people.
absolutely.
There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
But engaging with history, listening to different perspectives, and approaching these issues with empathy is crucial if we want to find a better way forward. Couldn't have put it better myself. And as we continue to wrestle with these questions, it's vital to remember the resilience and determination of immigrants throughout American history.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
It is.
They've faced incredible challenges, systemic barriers,
Yeah.
and outright discrimination.
Absolutely.
Yet they continue to persevere and contribute so much to the fabric of American society.
Their stories are a testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a message that resonates even more strongly in today's world, where division and fear often seem to dominate the headlines.
Right.
It's a reminder that in the end, we're all connected by our shared humanity,
I like that.
and that recognizing the value immigrants bring to our communities is not just about being politically correct.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing a fundamental truth about what makes America, well, America.
I agree.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd like to pose a question to our listener.
Okay.
Something to really ponder. How can we, as a nation, create a more just and equitable immigration system?
Yeah.
One that acknowledges both the contributions of immigrants and the complex realities of this issue.
I love that. It's a challenge.
It is.
For sure, but it's a challenge worth taking on.
It is.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it starts with education,
Okay.
with understanding the historical context, and with recognizing the humanity of those who are most impacted by these policies.
Right.
It's about having difficult conversations, challenging our own assumptions,
Yeah.
and being willing to find common ground, even when it feels impossible.
I completely agree. There are no simple solutions.
Yep.
But by engaging with history, listening to diverse perspectives, and approaching this issue with empathy,
Yeah.
I believe we can work towards a more just and compassionate approach to immigration.
Absolutely.
It's a conversation that needs to happen, and it needs to involve everyone.
Well said.
Yeah.
And remember, it's not just about abstract policy. It's about people. The human stories behind immigration are what make this issue so powerful, so challenging, and ultimately so important to get right.
I think that's a perfect place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
explored some complex history,
Yes.
and grappled with some big questions,
For sure.
but we're not done yet.
Nope.
There's still more to unpack as we continue our deep dive into the world of Mexican-American immigration in the 21st century. You know, it's really striking me as we're wrapping up this deep dive how much these debates about immigration, they just seem to repeat themselves throughout history.
Oh, totally. It's like we're constantly having the same arguments,
Right.
just in slightly different forms.
Exactly. We hear concerns about economic impacts, calls for tighter border control,
Yeah.
and then the counter arguments about, the need for pathways to citizenship and recognizing the contributions of immigrants. These themes just keep popping up.
They do. It really makes you think, like, how do we break free from these cycles and find more sustainable and humane solutions? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, what's the next chapter of this story going to hold?
Right.
What lessons can we learn from the past to create a better future for everyone?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
How will the U.S. navigate these challenges and opportunities presented by immigration in the years to come?
Right.
I mean, will we continue to repeat the mistakes of the past?
Yeah.
Or can we forge a new path forward?
I don't have a crystal ball or anything,
Right.
but one thing I know for sure, understanding this historical context,
Yeah.
it is absolutely crucial for making informed decisions about the future.
Right.
We can't just ignore the past and hope for the best.
Right.
We have to learn from it, grapple with it,
Yeah.
and use that knowledge to guide our actions.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
History may not give us all the answers, but it certainly provides valuable insights and lessons
Yes.
that we just can't afford to ignore.
For sure. It's
Yeah.
like having a roadmap, but one that also warns you about potential hazards and detours.
I like that, yeah. It helps us see the big picture, you know?
It does.
Recognize patterns
Absolutely.
and hopefully avoid repeating those same mistakes over and over again.
Exactly.
Right. And it reminds us that these issues,
Yeah.
they're just so incredibly complex,
They are?
multifaceted, and there are no easy solutions.
Nope, not at all.
Right. There's no magic bullet, no single policy that will magically address all the concerns and satisfy everyone.
Right.
It requires a nuanced and multifaceted approach, one that takes into account the economic, the social, the political, and the human dimensions of immigration.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key takeaway from this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
Immigration is a complex issue with a long and often contentious history.
Absolutely.
There are no easy answers.
Nope.
But by engaging with the past, listening to diverse perspectives, and approaching the issue with empathy and understanding, we can work towards a more just and equitable future for everyone.
I love that. A
Yeah.
just and equitable future for everyone.
Yeah, that's what we should be striving for.
It is.
And I think this conversation has given us a lot to think about as we continue to grapple with these issues as individuals, as a society.
Absolutely. It's all about keeping those lines of communication open, learning from history, and challenging our own assumptions.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Okay.
I want to thank you for guiding us through this complex and fascinating topic.
It was my pleasure.
I feel like I've learned so much, and I hope our listener has too.
Me too. And to our listener out there, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep engaging with these important conversations.
Yes.
The future of immigration, and indeed the future of our nation, depends on it.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.